Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to the Hoon, where co-host Peter Bale and I go around the week's news in geopolitics and Aotearoa's political economy, with a whole bunch of experts, academics and politicians, all to understand our worlds better and have some fun. Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome in, everyone. I hope you've made it back for a short week, but a reasonably big week in the world of politics and the economy and markets and all sorts of things. I'm Bernard Hickey, co-host of the Hoon on the Kaka, remembering that the Hoon, or Hoon, is the collective noun for the Kaka, and co-host Peter Bale. Peter, how are you?
Bernard, it's very good to see you, and we should tell the audience that you and our lovely producer Simon, we met Simon for the first time this week because you both came to lunch at my house, and I did my triple cooked Heston Blumenthal chips, which took me 2 days, of course, to prepare. And there's somebody who'll be listening to this who'll say, "Bugger, I love it when he does those because they do go clack clack when you put them on the plate," and he loves them. But anyway, it was lovely to see Simon in reality rather than just virtually, and to talk bollocks with you.
Yes, we're pretty good at that.
And we top quality bollocks, as we've said before.
Yeah, and they were top quality fish and chips. Thank you very much, Peter.
Now, we were talking last week about you having gone to Westport, and I was struck this week that our friend Shane Jones is condemning Greenpeace protesters who protested about coal mining on the West Coast. And for once, I agreed with him because it's coking coal. And I think it's entirely legitimate to get top quality coking coal out of there. So were you down there with the Greenpeace people protesting, Bernard? Is that what you secretly went down there to do?
No, I wasn't. In fact, we were actually on the Denniston Plateau at the same time, but weren't aware about the protest. I think it was not very politic or very kind, actually, for Shane Jones to come out and do this. He's not alone, though. Of course, Winston Peters is pushing as many buttons as he can, as often as he can, as hard as he can. And it's all, on brand at the moment. This is Shane Jones of the Freddy the Frog's Gonna Get It mode. And
also we're going to sort out the P dealers in Kaikohe, which I've got again. Oh my God, I've agreed with Shane on two things. P dealers,
it's easy
people protesting coking coal.
Easy to say these things, particularly if you're in opposition, or at least you're pretending to be in opposition. Yeah, which he certainly is at the moment, and that's part of the issue. I disagree with you, Peter, on the whole coal protest.
I know you do, but coking coal is going to be a necessary evil for a while, in my opinion, if we want steel. Now, Bernard, the other thing, you brought up a really interesting issue, which we have sort of touched on a couple of times, and I was reading a couple of our scripts. I know, like I said last week, it's ridiculous to think we even have them. The tone of politics. I mean, what is this all gearing towards the local elections that we're getting some very nasty, edgy, prickly, and as Chloe Swarbrick says, imported kind of culture war stuff, particularly from New Zealand First and particularly from ACT, less so on the culture wars other than Maori issues or treaty issues. What's going on, Bernard? Is it they're warming up and trying a few things out, or are they...
Well, particularly New Zealand First saw how successful it was for them in the general election, because remember, if they had not won the 1.5% of the vote from the anti-vax, anti-treaty brigade in the election, and there was a significant strategic negotiation between the owners, if you like, of those collected about 3 or 4 percentage points of the vote, who were going to be wasted with 2 or 3 of these small parties that popped up before the election. 1 or 2 of them got together a clear attempt to avoid being wasted and to try to win some concessions. And they did a deal with Winston Peters, and it worked. And these sorts of culture war, meme style approaches to politics, which frankly are irrelevant and they mean nothing, is
Well, except that they do appeal to a certain segment.
yeah. I mean, there's a bunch of the population who are infected by social media,
Yeah.
and it's awful. The more I see of it,
We
the
need to
more
bring them over to the Kaka, Bernard.
that's true. There's still that part of me, that Xi Jinping part of me, that wants to
Yes, I know,
turn the
Bernard.
damn thing
Yeah,
off.
I know, I know. Well, I was just look. David Mooring makes a very good point, which is kind of the point that I was trying to make. That Winston is sort of seemingly in election year mode. I know there's local elections in September, but he definitely tries to. There's this funny thing that those two coalition partners have to do with National, is find space for them both ideologically within the coalition, or does he just want to blow it up?
No, I think he's seen a couple of election cycles where he was subsumed by an unpopular government and then was kicked out of parliament altogether. And he wants to differentiate himself, be in opposition while being in government. And one way to do that is to pick on these irrelevant strands, culture war strands, if you like, that aren't actually at the heart of the government. I mean, you could argue, there's been plenty of examples where Winston Peters could have thrown his toys out of the cot and walked out of the government. I mean, for example, on rail, I mean, the abandonment of the IREX project, which was one that he really fought for when
Had
he
he?
was in
Oh, I thought
government.
I thought he'd rather distance himself from that decision.
Well, he was able to argue he could, but he was right at the source of it, and certainly the initial rejection of that contract and the rejection of rail-enabled, not of rail capable ferries, was a real problem for Winston Peters. That's why he fought to take back that ministry and to essentially put the whole thing back on the table. And, there's been plenty of other examples where National have been pushing, for example, to try to reopen the debates around foreign ownership. So he is being...
He has to keep some powder dry. Do you think that's
yeah, and actually when he's been in government since the first time, so the first time he did make a mess and it caused all sorts of grief. But the second and third times, particularly with Labor, he was a good boy, so to speak,
Yeah.
and he didn't make the government appear divided. Although towards the end it was getting scratchy, and this time he's trying to do the same again, but with a much more aggressive "I'm in opposition" feel to it, which
interesting? You
it's
can rely on me to push this stuff through the coalition, kind of idea.
yeah. It's performative. Like this whole kerfuffle around we're going to be sure that everyone's a man and a woman. That is, apart from anything, it's nowhere near Parliament.
Kerfuffle is a word we don't hear from nearly enough, actually. But shenanigans and kerfuffle, I think, are two of my favourite words, actually. Yep.
Yeah, very closely associated with New Zealand First and ACT. And that whole, we're going to do this. No, you're not. You've put forward a bill that might be pulled out of the...
Well, a certain friend of ours wrote to the president of the New Zealand First, saying, "Hang on a minute, you said he's introduced a bill. It is not introduced. It's merely been put into the biscuit tin." I had to look up what the biscuit tin thing was, but I mean, I know what a biscuit tin is, but yeah.
I love it that our Parliament has merch for the biscuit tin.
Yeah.
You can buy
Is it Allsbrooks or Cadbury's or what?
No, it's just like a very generic tin, not labelled.
Oh, it isn't. It isn't literally a biscuit tin with
no.
Mount Cook on the top.
It's a little very generic tin, the sort of thing
Yeah.
you would have bought from the warehouse 20 years ago, with a piece of paper sticky taped on it that says, private members' bills.
Biscuit tin. Oh, nice. And because I thought it must be a biscuit tin with half the cameo creams eaten by Winston, or actually clearly eaten by Shane on the way. Or actually, Jerry would have eaten everything that was in there, wouldn't he, including the cameo creams.
So
before I become accused of fattestness, we talked a little. I mean, apart from the man and woman thing, let's just, because we sometimes talk about media. I as much as I sometimes find it difficult to listen to Radio New Zealand at the moment for various reasons. The Winston thing this week was an outrageous performative load of old bollocks.
It was
And
also
it
a
was
breach.
entirely legitimate to bring in, sorry, because one of the things that he complained about, or how he triggered it, was having a little segment from Keir Starmer, who was literally with Luxon, I think, at that time, talking about the definition of a man and a woman, which of course came from the UK Supreme Court this week, and it was just the whole thing was a performative fiasco. But now I see some of the people that we both know saying, actually, the reason, RNZ does have too much money, and Labour gave RNZ that money so that they could do the opposition work for Labour while it's in opposition. And I just thought, if only Willie Jackson were in fact that clever. It is.
Yeah.
This is ridiculous. And as you said last week, it's making up for decades of underinvestment.
Yeah, and remember that Radio New Zealand is really the only public funding of publicly available journalism. TVNZ really doesn't get any pure subsidies. You could say there's some implied subsidies because the capital is not returning a dividend at the moment. But New Zealand has the lowest public funding for public interest journalism in the world, except for one other country, which is the United States. That's right, per capita. And what Winston Peters said the day before yesterday was a clear breach of the law. The law says that ministers are not allowed to try to publicly threaten Radio New Zealand's with removal of funding because it is a breach of the ministerial guidelines on influence.
Well, it's also potentially a breach of the cabinet rules because I think the budget is going to possibly have a little shift in it for Radio New Zealand.
Yeah, and it's a
It's
real.
all just so performative. It's mean, unpleasant, and
it's just
he's
plain
a grumpy old bugger.
It's just plain shitty.
Yes.
It's also really ugly because Corin Dan.
Shall we get him on to have a little bit of a tiff with him as well? Except I'm not sure I could be. I was thinking this actually the other day. I was thinking, could I possibly be as polite as Corin Dan was? I think you might. I think I might have got. There might have been buttons pushed that were not as professional as Corin's.
Yeah, and this is the thing. Corin is a serious journalist. He's been in the press gallery for many, many, many years and will have spent many, many, many hours having perfectly civil conversations with Winston over glasses of whiskey.
Many glasses of whiskey.
Yep, and
possibly too many, in fact.
And for Winston to say that to Corin is just it's
Shitty,
it's just like someone that you've known for decades and who's a colleague essentially in your workplace, then to come out and say that stuff in public is just awful.
So Bernard, let's just quickly, before we bring in Catherine, because speaking of people we've drunk with for decades, we haven't actually. I haven't met Catherine in reality yet, but we've got Catherine Dyer coming up on climate. We've got Robert Patman, as so often, from Otago University on international affairs. You're going to do a soliloquy, and we're going to talk about the New Zealand economy related to Trumpy things. And because we've talked a bit too long before bringing Catherine in, I really want to talk to you possibly at the end, maybe before your soliloquy, about some of these Trumpy things, because I don't think we can turn poor old Robert into an economic historian as well as a military historian, professor of international affairs and so on. But I think we do have to address the fiasco that we kind of all knew was coming or hoped was coming with Trump, but has really come this week.
Yeah, no, that's definitely on the agenda. Catherine, lovely to see you. Thank you very much for jumping on. And at some stage, we must ensure that you are able to sample some of Peter's amazing fish and chips. That would be really, really good. Catherine, this week has been an interesting one here locally on climate change, with the government abstaining on a key piece of global climate change cooperation, and a reasonably rare one involving an actual pricing of carbon. And this is the levy being put on by the global shipping industry on carbon emissions to try to reduce shipping emissions, which are substantial. So could you tell us a bit more about what appears to have gone on here with New Zealand's stance?
Yeah, it's really interesting and quite telling that New Zealand has abstained from the vote on that carbon charge, and there's a couple of different elements to this. So, you, you know, New Zealand was one of very few countries that abstained. There were some that opposed it, and these were the fossil fuel countries like Saudi Arabia and the Middle East and so on. And there were a few Pacific Island countries who abstained, but their reasons for abstaining were completely different to New Zealand's. So they abstained because they didn't feel the deal went far enough, and because they wanted more of the levies to be available to them to help to deal with the effects of rising sea levels and so on. So that was why they abstained. And bearing in mind, this is a negotiation that was ongoing for 10 years. And so New Zealand comes along and says, oh, we need to do a bit more analysis of the impacts of it. And it's like, well, 10 years wasn't enough for you. You need another 10. And, you know, obviously the real concerns for New Zealand was the cost that it would add to shipping to and from New Zealand, which is, you know, how most of the stuff that we import and export gets moved around. But, you know, the fact that pretty much everyone else, other than the US pulling out and the Middle East and stuff, did vote for it and did feel like they'd had enough time to talk about it after 10 years. That's pretty disappointing and quite telling, I think.
Catherine, where do these decisions come from? Is that an MFAT vote? Is that from somebody inside MFAT, i.e., well, Winston, effectively? I mean, obviously he would take advice, but...
Yeah, I mean, I would say so. That would be, you know, done through MFAT. The negotiations would have been through MFAT, but I imagine that a decision on whether to vote on something like that, I imagine it would be talked about at cabinet level.
Absolutely, and this is it was a really interesting decision because it was right at the focal point of a bunch of competing influences. Firstly, you've got the United States deciding not to be part of it, and of course they're on a complete, you know, another planet when it comes to climate right now, and New Zealand doesn't want to upset the United States too much right now, so they've decided, well, how can we not vote for it and be part of the, you know, climate change, addressing climate change agenda, if you like, the sort of green Europe and what's going on in the Pacific Islands. How can we not be part of that team, but at the same time not be part of the pure, right, we're throwing our toys out of the cot, we're leaving the whole thing. And so it was a really sort of weak and sneaky little way to deal with it, because not only are you pissing off and going against our policies on this for decades, you're also really screwing the Pacific Islands, who are supposed to be our strategic partners. Now, you can be sure that China voted for this. And when the Pacific Islands think about, hey, you know, this is one action which is actually could help us, and we're the ones being killed by climate change right now, having a supposed strategic partner like New Zealand in their backyard actually not vote for this thing, and not even have the courage of its convictions to say we're not voting for it because we're cozying up to the United States. It's just awful. And the way it was handled was just, I know that they're trying to keep their head below the parapet with the United States, but the longer this goes on, the more it devalues and dissolves our reputation for being a laggard and a reliable middle power, which we're not at the moment. The other aspect of this that I thought was interesting, and it sort of ties into it, is this decision by the Department of Defense, the Ministry of Defense, to essentially downgrade climate change as one of the strategic drivers for our defense stance, which, you know, if you look at the United States military, at least before Trump's second presidency, it was rightly saying that climate change is one of the major causes of conflict in the world right now. And for the Department of Defense to dial it down, I mean, what did you think of that? I mean, how did that appear?
I mean, I would say, climate change, and in the way that it was presented in the last defence strategy, underlies a lot of the issues that you're facing on the surface, whether it's conflict or, whatever it is, whether it's disasters, conflict, all of the things that our defence will need to deal with are related to climate change and have climate change as an underlying force multiplier and an underlying factor in why they're happening. And so you're not really changing anything about what you're going to deal with. You're still going to set up your military to deal with conflict and disasters and all of those sort of things. You just don't want to talk about it now. And that is purely ideological. That has nothing to do with reasoned evidence or of what's actually going on. It is a decision to bury your head. That's all it is. And I mean, I don't know, I guess that kind of decision making I'm kind of starting to get used to seeing from Judith Collins. But, that's embarrassing, actually, that your decision would be, we're just not going to talk about this and we're going to bury our head and we're going to pretend it's not happening. And we'll deal with all of the things that are impacts as a consequence of climate change, but we just won't mention why we're doing it.
Particularly in the South Pacific. I mean,
Yeah.
if you think that this is our main region where we can make a difference, where we actually need to show up and be a partner for Pacific Islands at a time when they're under threat of drowning, apart from anything else, how on earth are we going to contest China's attempts to come into the region if we can't even go to them with a straight face and say, yeah, we support you in your efforts to stop drowning? And who's going to apart from anything else, who is going to have to go up there in a ship and help out after the next cyclone or the next disaster? It's us. Yeah. And if we can't even show up at a time like this, then who the hell are we? I mean, this is
it's a real loss. We will have a real loss of respect from other countries for that, for behaving that way. It's weird and it's pointless, and it's purely ideological, and yeah.
and also it's cowardly.
Yeah.
Because if you really want to, take that stance, do what Winston Peters has done over the last 2 or 3 years, still shocking to me that he's our foreign minister and deputy prime minister, and say things that suggest he thinks that climate change is a hoax, that actions to reduce emissions are pointless, and that we shouldn't have anything to do with them. That is, apart from anything else, it's denying what we know is scientifically true. And the people who work for our military, our defence establishment, our foreign affairs establishment, our trade establishment, they are serious people, and they are, having to face up to their colleagues in the diplomatic community and in the military. I mean, if you talk to the United States, these generals, the ones who've got PhDs and that sort of thing, they know for sure, because they've fought in Iraq and in Afghanistan and in Africa and Central America, where climate change is absolutely everything. It's driving all these conflicts. It just beggars belief. Catherine, thank you so much for coming on to the show.
Just nice that you snuck in a little soliloquy there.
A mini soliloquy.
Robert, how nice to see you, and what a fabulous jacket you're wearing.
Good evening.
Does it have suede elbow patches?
You'll be disappointed, Peter.
Oh, bugger. Yeah.
So I think we need some
another stereotype destroyed.
That's right. We'll need to do some fresh merch, Peter. Yeah. We'll have elbow patches with.
We'll have self-adhesive Velcro elbow patches called Patmans. Yeah. The Hoon Patman.
Yeah. Good.
Robert, how are you? We were just talking about the Pacific with Catherine and climate change and New Zealand deciding not to vote in favour of a step around climate change and shipping. We've also had this week this huge potential shake-up or likely shake-up of the State Department by Marco Rubio. Are there spaces when you see that stuff that New Zealand can fill to some extent? I mean, surely it's going to jeopardise. I mean, it's unclear, I think, based on my searches, what it's going to do to the Pacific. But there's got to be spaces there, no?
Well, in the context of the Pacific, it actually is basically demanding that New Zealand step up its game diplomatically. And the same probably applies for Australia as well in that region. But it's an extraordinary situation. I understand 130 offices of the State Department are being closed within the United States, and 700 staff are losing their jobs, some of whom are very senior. And I think it marks another step in the concentration of decision making in relation to foreign policy in the White House in the shape of the National Security Council. So Marco Rubio may find that there's always a bit of a tension between the State Department and the National Security Council, which, of course, the National Security Council is housed in the White House. It may well mean that National Security Council advisor increasingly has more say in foreign policy.
And
than
who was
Marco
that?
Rubio.
Tulsi Gabbard.
Tulsi Gabbard
Yeah.
she's head of 16 intelligence services. But ultimately it's another step of bolstering China, because in an interconnected world, diplomacy is more crucial than ever, and America is moving away from using its soft power. It's a huge own goal, and many American commentaries in the last 24 hours recognize that. The other thing is that there was a slightly sinister overtone to this, because Mr. Rubio said that this was designed to root out radical ideology,
Yes.
which apparently was entrenched in the State Department. This has overtones with the McCarthy era, except, of course, the language is slightly different, but the intent is the
And
same.
also McCarthy was only a congressman.
Yeah.
This is actually. This is actually.
But it did cause witch hunts,
Yep,
Peter,
absolutely.
in institutions like the State Department, where communist sympathisers were being rooted out. But it's the same sort of attempt to impose a certain political conformism. And the other thing is, Rubio indicated they will be stepping back from such radical commitments as maintaining human rights, international law, and also things like their legal commitments on. Well,
War
they
crimes
didn't
and
actually
so
say
on.
they'll step
Yeah.
back from the legal commitments, but there's an implication that they will be downplaying their commitments to things like genocide, etc.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was thinking that too, because I was talking about East West Street today, and the book by Philippe Sands, and the whole genocide versus crimes against humanity. This is such an extraordinary withdrawal yet again from a multipolar world, or a multilateral world.
The assumption underpinning it, of course, is that America can reassert itself, because what's behind Trump's attempt, I think, at this re-engineering process is to assert American global primacy. But I think it's delusional. I think many members of the Trump administration do not understand, and they've already seen that with Mr. Trump backtracking in the clash with China. We've seen Mr. Trump backtracking with his pause on tariffs, with the, as we discussed before, the bond market giving its verdict and not liking what was going on. And I suspect that the cutbacks in the world of diplomacy will surprise, the effects of those cutbacks may even surprise some of the hardliners in the White House at the moment, because they seem to think that the rest of the world is going to somehow roll over to the American agenda. What is the vision of the Trump White House? I think essentially a reassertion of US primacy and America positioning itself to reorder the world, with America being the key pivot in that world. And I don't think the rest of the world is going to buy that.
Well, it's also moved on from there. I wonder, Robert. Sorry, I'm just interrupting Bernard slightly here. The Ukraine today, or the Ukraine story rather than the Ukraine. This extraordinary stitch up, where you've yet again got Zelensky being attacked as talk about victim blaming. And we're in a position where the United States is saying, well, if you don't give Vlad what he's got, literally what he's got, including Crimea, then we're just going to step away, and you can spend the next 3 years fighting him and lose your entire country. And the idea that in 2011, or was it 2014, 2011, right, that Ukraine allowed Russia to take Crimea is just, it's such an extraordinary sort of perversion of history.
Yeah, I think it was 2014 when they annexed Crimea, but let's not quibble about dates. I mean, at the end of the day,
God forbid.
it was illegally seized. And so let's just consider the implication of this, which is extraordinary for previous generation of decision makers in Washington, that the United States is trying to put together a peace settlement which actually endorses the illegal seizure of territory by Vladimir Putin, both in Crimea and in the eastern part of Ukraine. And what is even more extraordinary is the Trump administration itself, as Zelensky pointed out today in a statement, actually said in 2018, in a statement issued by the Trump administration, the first one, that they could not recognize the illegal seizure of Crimea and will continue to withhold recognition. So Mr. Trump is actually contradicting himself in a number of ways. But I suppose, as one rather cynical American commentator said, if you get a felon in the White House, this don't expect too much respect for international law. So, you know, in a sense, we shouldn't be surprised by this. But I don't think the Europeans are buying it. And I also don't think Zelensky is going to buy it. I mean, Zelensky can't accept this. He simply wouldn't politically survive. And too many Ukrainians have died to accept Mr. Trump's recipe for peace. So we are seeing, I think, the final step to a major divorce between Europe and the United States. The question is, which way is New Zealand going to position itself?
Bernard, excuse me, we do the segues here, but that was a brilliant... Okay, we'll elaborate on that. I think that's probably what Bernard just wanted to ask you about, because also, doesn't this send, you know, a might as right signal to China as regards Taiwan or anything else?
I think it conveys weakness to China, as we've discussed before. I mean, China will not be impressed by the most powerful country in the world siding with a country like Russia, which the Chinese know full well have broken the rules, which they've always, up to the Ukraine war, so zealously upholded with regard to territorial integrity and the principle of state sovereignty. I think, once again, the Trump administration is inadvertently bolstering China and making them more assertive, which is a considerable challenge for us in the
So you bolster China and you bolster Russia.
Yes. The thing that Mr. Putin must be dreading, though, is Mr. Trump actually moving away and just washing his hands of Ukraine. I don't think he relishes that, because yes, that would be a prelude to Mr. Trump giving substance to his vision of a geopolitical alliance with Russia, but it would also effectively free the Europeans to pile in behind Zelensky. It was interesting, talking about Mr. Luxon's visit to London, that both Starmer and Luxon were absolutely strong in their support for Ukraine. Luxon described Zelensky as a real hero, and Mr. Starmer has already described him in those terms. I don't think they're going to bow down to the United States over the Ukraine situation. Again, the assumption seems to be, remember that this administration, in the words of Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, he's still there at the moment.
I think Tosser is defense Tosser, yes.
Your words, not mine.
Yes, of course.
But he described the Europeans as pathetic, and there was sort of, in that Signal chat you probably read, Peter, there was they were all sort of,
actually I was a member of both of them.
They were all saying here, they're all joining in, you know, saying how pathetic the Europeans were, and so they probably think the Europeans are going to crumble. I don't, and the question, there is a big question mark whether the Europeans can pull themselves together, but they certainly have the capability. They have 4 times the GDP EU countries than Russia does. And by the way, the Russians are not having a great time. I don't know if you've noticed this, but about 36 hours ago, the Ukrainians exploded a major ammunition dump, which is about 10% of their munitions went up in smoke.
It was just a fire.
Oh, I know, yes. Just a small trivia thing. But it's look, it's going to be a tricky period, but New Zealand will... I think New Zealand's nudging in the direction of the Europeans at the moment via Britain.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And the images we saw of Christopher Luxon and Starmer at the training facility, a stray cartridge hitting Christopher Luxon while they watched on, was quite stark. However, I think this week we've seen a couple of developments from both China and the United States pushing us into a corner, which asks the question, which way do we jump? Because we had not only China saying it was watching what other countries were doing that were its trading partners and would retaliate if any actions were taken that disadvantaged China. But of course, that's what America wants. It wants its trading partners to do trade deals, one-to-one trade deals with the United States, which do disadvantage China.
Oh, cool.
And we heard from Donald Trump in that interview on Fox News, the Spanish edition, that he was saying we're coming to a point where countries will have to choose between the United States or China.
Dream on.
Yeah. And this is where I find it interesting. We've basically put our head under the parapet, and occasionally we've nudged above it, and Winston Peters has dragged Christopher Luxon back down again, and we're still hiding under the wall. And at some point, though, both China and the United States are going to come round and say, right, mate, jump on one side or the other. And I was interested to see that China came out with some quite critical comments about New Zealand today. The Chinese ambassador made some comments. And I do wonder how
What
close
sort of comments did he make? I'm sorry, I missed that.
Yeah, so we saw from the Chinese ambassador, and I'll put a link in the show notes, that New Zealand should be careful in the way that it talks about things. So we had a spokesperson for the Chinese embassy lodging diplomatic protests, in particular about a trip to Taiwan by some MPs, Stuart Smith, Greg Fleming, Hamish Campbell, so 3 national MPs, 2 Labour MPs, and 1 each from New Zealand First and ACT. They turned up in Taiwan and had a public meeting with the Taiwanese government. There were pictures and everything. And so China came back and said it had lodged protests about that. And the quotes are quite strong from China. Quote, the wrongdoings of relevant New Zealand MPs severely violate the solemn political commitments made by New Zealand to China when the two countries established diplomatic ties. So the Chinese are putting the pressure on. We can only hope that that Trump is so distracted with revolts within his own party, the bond markets, and his donors that he doesn't see us do our thing. But China's watching. You know,
It's
they've
hardly
got
Nancy Pelosi.
Yeah, but don't you think they're both mutually delusional? Both Washington and China believe the world depends critically on either of them. I think if China believes that, it's just as deluded as the Trump administration. The fact of the matter is New Zealand and most countries will do what they've done for some time, the middle and small powers. They'll keep hedging. They'll pretend not. It's not in our interest to be aligned with either. Not strictly. We want to be aligned with both, loosely. And so that's, in a sense, I understand China sending warning shots to countries not to get too engaged with Mr. Trump's brand of bilateralism. I understand that, but I think that's one thing. I think really what China's saying is don't jeopardize the relationship you already have with us. I think that's the crucial thing. I don't think realistically they can expect other countries to halt their diversification and strictly align themselves with China. Sorry.
Robert, might anybody we know be writing a book or about to publish a book about the difficulty of balancing that kind of multilateralism and from small countries?
Oh, well, watch this space. But things are developing.
Good.
No, look, all I'm saying is that in a sense, and this is a difficult point for superpowers to absorb, but they're weaker, not because they're less strong. They are weaker in international terms than they have been with previous generations of great powers. And that's because many of the issues we face can only be solved internationally. And in a sense, that's not a problem for small countries like New Zealand. We've always looked to multilateralism. I do think where the Trump administration has spectacularly shot itself in the foot has been to overestimate its leverage, and also, I think, in the process, seriously neglect the real commitment that many countries, other liberal democracies, have to free trade, because it's delivered. I mean, Japan is another country which is seriously alarmed by the protectionism of the United States, and that's why we've seen South Korea and Japan tactically line up with China in upholding the free trade system. So I think there is the space for New Zealand to continue to have good relations with China without becoming a Chinese stooge or close ally. And I don't think I think the superpowers are deluding themselves if they think that they can actually, carve up the world between them. I don't think that's realistic. And if you look at countries like in the Pacific, you speak to Pacific leaders, talk to countries from ASEAN, they are just as jealous about their sovereignty. And very few countries in the world see their future as clones or, if you like, satellites of either superpower. And the question is, in a sense, with the two superpowers engaging in a trade war, it has huge global ramifications for everyone, but it also creates opportunities. And one of the opportunities that we have as a country, and many countries have, is to basically seek out those countries which are serious about rules-based trade and also rules-based international order. And that could lead to a complete realignment of international politics.
Yes, which was it's very interesting, Robert. I was just thinking as you were doing your little soliloquy then of a kind of spinning top that we've had over the last 60 years, which may not be perfect, may wobble from time to time, but has delivered phenomenal prosperity. And we've got somebody who is so old and so distorted in his thinking that he's jolted that and tried to take the top away from the table, in a sense, because he's got this idea that somehow in the past things were greater, America was greater, and now we're in a much more, we're in the world the US created.
Yeah, and also he has seriously, I think, misread the things that have given America so much power in the world, which is its dominance of multilateral institutions, and in a sense, America has been selective about the rules it applies. We saw that with its invasion of Iraq and its selectivity about adhering to humanitarian laws we've seen in the Middle East. But at least up till Mr. Trump, it saw it had an interest in at least paying lip service to those commitments. But now Mr. Trump seems to be cutting America loose. In a short, Mr. Trump's foreign policy would be less worrying if it was not being accompanied by increasing signs of movement towards autocracy within the United States. The attack on multiple institutions. We mentioned one, the State Department. But there is a real desire at the moment in the Trump administration to silence its critics. And I don't just mean cracking down on a few, but to institutionally concentrate power in the White House. And the Constitution is being largely ignored in this bid to concentrate power. The media is facing, and you guys will know this better than I, real pressure in the United States. We've got also what has been, I think, key institutions in America's innovative economy, universities, particularly in the world of science, facing tremendous pressure. So,
Chris, you need your own podcast, Robert.
No, I think the point here is that I think we can, all these things, if it was just the foreign policy, I think those politicians in New Zealand who say we've got to wait and see, they might have a point. If America's democracy, if Mr. Trump was pursuing this America First policy, a bit like his first term actually, but there was less pressure to, if you like, move towards an autocracy.
And there were some adults in the room. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there'd be, but I think there's less wiggle room now. And for
Speaking of
those
wiggling,
holding. And I
speaking of
think
wiggling,
Luxon,
there's Bernard.
I think Mr.
I'm sorry.
Luxon is really indicating that the national part of the coalition is actually siding with the middle powers and the smaller liberal democracies that want a free trade system to endure and are prepared to take measures to ensure that, even if it means irritating the White House.
I wonder, though, Robert, how long we can keep our head under the parapet on certain things. Before you came on, we talked with Catherine about New Zealand's non-stance on the vote on the shipping levy. You might have heard that we abstained after, decades of being part of the process about negotiating this levy with Pacific Island nations and a whole bunch of other countries. And we abstained. And that on various issues we have been quieter than perhaps we should have been.
I agree.
How long before our, fellow middle powers and, these Pacific nations go, occasionally you need to put your head up. You can't stay down there all that time.
I agree. And I'm one of these people who believed it was never realistic to have a softly approach to what's going on in the United States. I think the government has seriously underestimated the soft power damage it's doing to itself. It should have expressed full solidarity with Canada and Denmark, and it still should do so.
All right, I have a final...
Let's be quite clear. Politics is not a question of easy choices. It's always a choice, difficult choices, but on balance, our interests, I think, do seriously lie with supporting rules-based trade, those who support it, and that includes Canada and Denmark. And I think we need to make our views very clear. At the moment, we seem to be appeasing a society which actually is assaulting our interests. So that seems a rather bizarre thing to do.
Yeah. Robert, I wonder whether the probable potential re-election of Albanese and a Labour government in Australia and the remarkable potential re-election of or election of Carney in Canada might be that moment, and where that would come, coming in the next 2 weeks, really. And also, just somebody on the chat is saying, Robert may be a professor, but he's not always right. And can I just say, if we only had people who were always right on the show, we wouldn't have a show. I mean, it goes for you, Michael Wolff, everybody.
You're the guy on the chat. Of course, I don't have a monopoly on wisdom. Anybody who pretends they have is deceiving you.
Well, they're not going to get an A in their pass.
Unfortunately, we've got lots of politicians who can never admit they're wrong. And do they convince the public? Of course they don't.
But just what significance do you think the Australian election and the Canadian election have? And then we need to let you go. Jesus Christ. Bernard's saying, is there a question here to me in the chat?
Yes, I agree, Peter. I do think both the Australian and Canadian elections are important because there's probably quite a fair amount of foreign interference going on in the Canadian election. Certain parties are very keen for the Trumpist candidate to put up a good show. And I think there's no secret that the Trump people would like Mr. Peter Dutton to prevail in Australia. So I think decisive victories by Albanese and also Mr. Carney will, I think, change the terms of the debate within New Zealand's foreign policy to some degree. I think those who are seeking, despite the evidence, to shore up our relations with the Trump administration will be weakened by such a development, and possibly it will give more impetus to people within the National Party, within the coalition, to say, no, we've got to protect our interests, and that means expanding our diversifying with those countries that are wedded to the free trade arrangements.
Robert, thank you so much for coming
Robert.
on.
Thank you.
You may not be right, but we appreciate it.
We're certainly
wrong in excellent companies once. Absolutely. The rest is, I think we just say the rest is bollocks is going to be our new. I'll talk to Gary Lineker about the rest is bollocks.
Oh, I'm a big fan of Gary's.
Yeah, no, he's an amazing character.
Superb footballer and also a pretty astute observer, I think.
Yeah. And apart from anything else, he's a podcasting guru and expert in
monetization of podcasts.
Exactly.
I'm bringing private. Anyway,
good.
Thank you very much, Robert.
Yep.
Thank you.
Go
All
for
the
it.
best. Bye.
Thank you. Cheers.
Bernard, the idea that you would accuse me of not asking a fucking question, sorry, a question within in our thing is so ridiculous. Although I did listen to last week and thought, hang on a minute, there's quite a long question there. Now, you wanted to talk about the government. It's I think we're combining a soliloquy with a news thing about the government's fiscal position in New Zealand. Is that right?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out the problems we have at the moment in a fiscal policy sense, i.e., how is the government responding to this shock that we're seeing globally now, and what might it mean for our economy? So in the last week, we've had the reiteration by Nicola Willis, the finance minister, of the government's tough fiscal policy. Her argument is that the government needs to get its books in order so that there's confidence of businesses to invest and that interest rates can come down. The problem there is that it means the government itself stops spending on particularly infrastructure. And that's what we've seen over the last year, is a significant reduction in government spending on housing, hospitals, roads, schools. And that withdrawal of spending and money in itself has reduced business and consumer confidence, and is actually at this stage meaning that the recovery, which should be in pretty good shape by now, is stuttering. And we're seeing that in all sorts of numbers, from retail sales through the housing market, where volumes remain stagnant. Also, some numbers on research and development out yesterday for 2024 showing that our R&D spend at 1.5% of GDP remains barely at half the OECD average. There's no way we're going to get a productivity-led recovery unless we're investing in R&D and in business investment.
But we've just shut down Callaghan and these other things.
Exactly.
Maybe they weren't effective. I don't know. But yeah, I'm just not sure we're quite committed to innovating.
No. And the problem for the government is it has two real strategies here, which is that it's going to pull back from the economy, and it hopes that the private sector and the housing sector steps forward. The problem is that neither is happening. And the private sector is still feeling nervous because they're just not seeing the money coming through their tills. Consumers are nervous too because they're seeing their friends and family lose jobs or leave the country. And also, they've seen 10,000 construction workers lose their jobs because the government has pulled back from the likes of Kāinga Ora, from hospital builds, from roading and that sort of thing. And this is a problem for the economy, which is now also experiencing the headwinds from the rest of the world. So this for me is a growing issue for the government, which given the comments from the finance minister in the last couple of days, it looks like she's going to go into the budget on May the 22nd with we're going to hang tough and hold the line.
And austerity, would you describe that as a sticking to austerity budget, Bernard?
It's not as austere as the sort of David Cameron hammering away for years and years after 2010. But to be fair,
it may feel like it.
Yeah, and particularly there's only a couple of areas where the government can effectively reduce spending, and that is in capital expenditure, and it's also in what you'd call marginal social welfare expenditures. So special needs grants, special housing grants, loans to people who don't have anywhere to live, the sort of thing where you turn up to MSD and you say, "Can I have some money to buy some food for my family?" And you don't. And that's why we've got 600,000
scale issues.
Yeah. And this is where it's causing problems for the wider economy, and it's starting to show through. And this is going to be a problem for the government as it goes into the next year, as it's clear consumer confidence remains weak. And while that's the case, confidence in the government will remain weak, and the pressure will be on for it to get off this, frankly, it's not just old-fashioned, it's pointless task of trying to get back to surplus. There are no countries in the developed world who are in surplus. And there's a reason you have to run a surplus as a government. That's because when you have a current account deficit, you have to keep putting the money in to make sure that your economy doesn't deflate.
Wait a second. There's a reason for, you said actually, you started that with, there's a reason to run a surplus. Whereas I think you
No,
mean there's reason to run a deficit, right?
there's reason to run a deficit,
So
which
say it
is
again, because otherwise Simon will find this impossible to edit. Yeah.
so there's a reason to continue to. There's a reason you have to run a deficit as a developed country, which is that if you don't, it makes it very difficult for your economy to grow, particularly when you've got a current account deficit. And there is going to be a crunch in the next year or so as the government realizes the economy isn't recovering that strongly, and it doesn't want to go into the election with effectively the boat becalmed. It needs to have some wind in the sails and some speed on the water, and it's just not. It's true. It's true. I mean,
Jesus, your metaphors are getting better. Now, Artie Farty 87 would like to know if you could, because is this all right, Bernard? Have you finished your soliloquy?
Yeah.
Because now that I've subbed your conversation, because I hate it when I hear podcasts and everything where the poor person hasn't been challenged when they just misspeak slightly. Is there any possibility of a credit crunch in New Zealand?
Not at this stage, because our financial system is not entwined with the global financial system in the way that in 2008 the US banking system was. It's worth watching, though, what's happening in the US Treasuries market and the financial system in the United States, because the other big theme of this last week has been growing fears about the preeminence and the reliability of the US dollar and whether or not the US government will repay its debts. And when the current US president says things like he's thinking about how to renegotiate the debts or somehow pay it with Bitcoin or something silly like that, you do run that risk. And we've seen a significant outflow of assets from the United States into Europe, into Switzerland, into Japan in the last week, a slump in the dollar. Now, it rebounded today because Donald Trump appeared to back off. Yeah. Oh. And it flipped, yeah.
Gyrations are just extraordinary. This is what I wanted to ask you at the beginning. It was about, because you're the best person to talk about this. Your 5 and 5 podcast for ANZ is very good on this topic. This flip-flop today saying, I'm going to reduce the tariffs on China, but it's not going to be zero. And I'm not going to fire the Fed governor. I mean, what the hell?
Yeah, as Logan Roy would say, he's not a serious person. And this is, when you don't have the credibility of the global financial markets, this is extraordinary, because remember that Wall Street were all for Trump. They loved him. They donated billions of dollars to him. Even after he was elected, there was $250 million donated to Trump's inauguration festivities. Just imagine, you have a party, it's your birthday party, people turn up and they give you $250 million to have a really, really good party.
Where does it really go, though, do you think? Yeah.
Well, it's, yeah. And essentially, he's alienated his natural supporters in a most fundamental way and endangered, you could argue, the most important and most highly valued item of trust in the global economy, which is, do I trust the US government to pay me back when I expect it?
What I was going to say also, Bernard, is what you're really talking about is service. Do I trust them to service the debt? Do I trust them to maintain these commitments? And I just think we're seeing all commitments thrown out not to overtake your soliloquy. Are you finished with your soliloquy, Bernard?
That's that. On that, there is just one other thing. Which
is a final soliloquy.
A final soliloquy, which is you and Robert rightly talked about the McCarthy witch hunt that went on in the 50s, and it struck me that there is a direct line between the McCarthy witch hunt and what Donald Trump is doing right now, and that is Roy Cohn.
Yep.
Roy Cohn was the main advisor to McCarthy and was eventually the mentor for Donald Trump. And Roy Cohn has a particularly ruthless and sociopathic approach to politics, which eventually brought him down and brought down McCarthy.
Well, I think you'll find HIV brought him down, but yep.
Yeah, yeah, and personally, yeah, but in terms of his political abilities, and I thought it was very interesting to put that connection there, and there is a clear line of
Yes.
one person,
Yes.
and sadly, it's still with Trump, and we'll see
So we
how it
recommend
all
watching The Apprentice for the extraordinary performance in watching the Roy Cohn character in The Apprentice, the movie, not the television show. Now,
Yeah.
shall I give you a skateboarding dog, Bernard?
Yes, please. Yeah.
And I regret to say it is a Trump one. And I do say, and honestly to our lovely audience, because we have to let poor old Simon go. I do try not to do Trump, but the Trump stuff is so bonkers and it's so impactful. So the one I like though is a skateboarding dog, and it's Steve Witkoff, the theoretical billionaire New York real estate guy who Trump has assigned to help solve Ukraine and various other things, went to the Elysee Palace, which is 300 years old, last week, and said, "This is beautiful. This actually looks like President Trump's club in Mar-a-Lago," which is just so bonkers. And then, of course, that and I'm sure people have noticed this if they're watching television, which I try not to at the moment, but Trump has turned the Oval Office both into his main press conference place, but also into a sort of gold bedecked, trashy version, even trashier version of Mar-a-Lago. And as the Guardian said, since returning to the White House, Trump has applied guilt to the Oval Office with the same light touch that he brings to the cap's key lock, which is to say it's everywhere. Gold knickknacks cover every surface, while gold-framed paintings climb the walls. Trump has added gold highlighting to the room's ornamental molding, imported gold cherubs from Mar-a-Lago, crowded the mantelpiece with gold urns, and even affixed what I can only describe as gold filigree doodads to the walls and fireplace. He's also put a gold cover over the button, which he presses to bring in another Diet Coke.
It's awful. Those doodads on the wall, the pictures of which have been zipped around the internet, are of course, gold plated at best, and more like gold plated.
That's right. That's exactly the point that was made also by the Guardian. Yep,
imported
correct.
From China.
Can I also say, I think it's brilliant that we've managed to avoid mentioning the Pope, but obviously that's an extraordinary story, and I find, Bernard, as we can call this is not a skateboarding dog about the Pope, although one of the things that I love was one of his Pope-mobiles was a Renault 4, not dissimilar to mine in Spain, but I always loved his comment about essentially homosexuality, where he said, who am I to say? That's what I think of. I mean, that was a beautiful thing to say. It didn't necessarily achieve results in the end, but anyway, we've managed to avoid the man-woman thing, as opposed to, other than discussing it about Winston Peters, and we've managed to avoid the Pope to some extent.
Yes, this is
maybe next week.
One of the achievements. And I'd like to end on a quote from the Pope, though. I'd like to end on a quote from the Pope.
Well, you are Catholic, in fact, of course. Well, you were brought up Catholic, so yes, good point, Bernie.
So he said once, "The earth, our home, is beginning to look more and more like an immense pile of filth. A selfish and boundless thirst for power and material prosperity leads both to the misuse of available natural resources and to the exclusion of the weak and the disadvantaged." And that was the Pope talking not just about the environment, but about social issues.
Bernard, what a lovely... You're a poet.
Yes.
Goodbye.
Well, I'm quoting someone else. Thank you very much to everyone. Ka kite anō. We'll see you all again next week after the Anzac Day commemoration tomorrow. Ka kite anō.
Bye-bye, Bernard. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.